Slavery is over. Get over it. You've heard it. Maybe you've said it. Maybe someone said it to you and you didn't know how to answer. Here's the strange part. It's true. Slavery is over. But get over it assumes something else entirely. That whatever slavery broke got fixed when the laws changed. This video checks that assumption against the actual evidence. Because somewhere in the South, right after freedom, a black family sat down with a white landowner and signed a contract that looked like a fresh start. It wasn't. It was a debt they'd never be able to pay off. One that would keep their children and their children's children tied to that same land for generations. That's not ancient history. That's the part nobody mentions. So the question isn't whether slavery ended. It did. The real question is this. What does it actually take for a person, a family, a people to get over something like that? What has to happen first? And once we know what that actually requires, has it happened? Let's find out, honestly, using the evidence, not the slogan. Let's start by saying the obvious thing, because it's important. Slavery in America ended completely. Legally, the 13th Amendment passed in December of 1865, and it didn't leave room for exceptions. Nobody watching this video is enslaved because of what happened before 1865. That's not up for debate, and this video isn't here to argue otherwise. Ended full stop. It wasn't symbolic. 4 million people who had been legally classified as property became on paper full human beings with rights under the law. Families that had been split apart by sale could legally stay together for the first time. People who had been whipped for learning to read could now, at least in theory, walk into a schoolhouse. And a lot of people did walk through that door. Formerly enslaved people built churches, schools, and businesses within years of freedom. Some bought land. Some ran for office during Reconstruction. Over 2,000 Black Americans held public office in the years right after the war, including seats in the U.S. Senate. Freedom wasn't just a legal status. People used it immediately. So if the story stopped there, slavery ended and people built new lives, get over it might actually make sense. A wrong happened, it stopped, and people moved forward. That's a complete, fair story. And if that's all that happened, this video would already be finished. But that's not where the story stops. Because within just a few years of freedom, while many of those same freedmen were still alive, still remembering exactly what enslavement felt like, something else started happening across the South. Something that looked different on paper, had a different name, and was, in practice, alarmingly close to the thing that had just been declared illegal. Where this video actually needs to go next. Not backward, into slavery itself. That part is settled. Forward into what came right after it, bearing a different name. Because get over it only holds up if the harm actually stopped in 1865. And that's the very first thing we need to check against the record. Before we go further into history, let's step away from race for a second, because the phrase "get over it" isn't actually about slavery specifically. It's a claim about how healing works in general. So let's test it somewhere neutral first, somewhere nobody has strong feelings, so we can see the logic clearly before we bring the emotional weight back in. Imagine a house fire. A family loses almost everything. Their home, their savings, years of photos and belongings that can't be replaced. Now imagine someone telling them a month later, the fire's over, get over it. Most people would immediately recognize that's an unreasonable thing to say. Why? Because the fire ending isn't the same thing as the damage being repaired. For that family to actually get over the fire, a few specific things have to happen. First, the fire itself has to be out. No new flames, nothing actively still burning. Second, the damage has to actually get addressed. Insurance paid out, a new place to live, help rebuilding. Third, enough time and resources have to exist afterward for them to recover their footing. All three of those things happen, people genuinely can move on. That's not a controversial idea. It's just how recovery works. Whether we're talking about a fire, an illness, a bankruptcy, or a war, the harm stops. The damage gets addressed. Time and resources allow rebuilding. Skip any one of those three and getting over it stops being a choice. It becomes a demand without a path. So here's the test we're going to run for the rest of this video, using exactly those same three conditions applied to slavery instead of a house fire. Did the harm actually stop completely in 1865, or did it continue under a different name? Were the effects of 2.5 centuries of enslavement ever actually addressed? And has there been enough time and resource access since then to fully rebuild? This isn't about assigning blame to anyone alive today. Nobody watching this lit a match. But the 3-condition test doesn't care who's at fault. It only cares whether the conditions for recovery were actually met. If they were, get over it is a fair thing to say. If they weren't, it's asking someone to finish a race they were never allowed to fully start. So, let's test the first condition. Did the harm actually stop in 1865 completely, or did it continue wearing a different name? Right after emancipation, Southern states passed a wave of laws called Black Codes. On paper, they were about vagrancy in labor contracts. In practice, they let authorities arrest black people for being unemployed, then force them into labor contracts to pay off the arrest. Came sharecropping. Formerly enslaved families were offered land to farm in exchange for a share of the crop. Sounds like opportunity, and for landowners it was framed that way. But the landowner controlled the prices, the supplies, and the bookkeeping. Debts were carried over year to year quietly, deliberately, often through manipulated accounting a sharecropper had no way to challenge or even read. That's called debt peonage, a legal requirement to keep working until a debt was paid off. Except the debt almost never got paid off. It was structured not to. Families who had been free for years, sometimes decades, found themselves legally bound to the same land, the same landowner, working under threat of arrest if they tried to leave before the debt was settled. And if debt peonage didn't hold someone in place, the courts often did. States began arresting black men for minor or invented offenses, then leasing them directly to plantations, mines, and railroads as convict labor. This was called convict leasing, and it exploded in scale almost the exact moment slavery ended. Private companies paying the state for the labor of the people it had just freed. Here's the detail that should stop you. Peonage. This system of forced labor to pay off debt wasn't formally ended in the United States until 1966, not 1865, 1966. That means people were still being legally compelled into forced labor under this system during the lifetimes of people who are grandparents today, watching this video right now. When we ask the first question, did the harm actually stop when slavery ended? The honest answer is no, not fully and not quickly. It didn't disappear in 1865. It changed shape, changed its legal name, and kept running in plain sight for another century in some form before the country actually closed the loophole for good. That's condition 1. Test it against the record. Next, we test condition 2. Even where forced labor did eventually stop, were the effects of everything that came before it ever actually addressed? That's where the money enters the story, and where the numbers get harder to look away from. So let's test the second condition. Even after forced labor finally ended for good, were the effects of everything before it actually addressed? Let's jump forward to World War II, because this is where you can see the mechanism happen in real time, not as abstract history, but as a specific law applied differently to different people. In 1944, the government passed the GI Bill, free college, low-interest home loans, a real path into the middle class for returning veterans. It's often called one of the most successful pieces of legislation in American history, and it was, for millions of families. It just wasn't applied the same way to everyone who earned it by serving their country. Bill's home loans weren't handled directly by the government. Banks decided who actually got approved. And banks, at the time, openly refused to lend in black neighborhoods, a practice called redlining. In 1947, across 13 cities in Mississippi, over 3,200 GI-backed home loans were issued. 2 of them went to black veterans. 2 out of 3,200 black veterans who did manage to receive GI Bill benefits got, on average, only around 40% of what white veterans received in comparable value. Adjusted for inflation, that gap comes out to roughly $170,000 per veteran. Multiply that across more than 1 million black World War II veterans, and you're not looking at an accident. You're looking at a pattern. This matters because home ownership isn't just about having a house. It's how American families have historically built wealth that gets passed down to children, to grandchildren. A house bought in 1950 became college tuition in 1975, and a down payment for a grandchild in 2005. Families locked out of that loan in 1947 were locked out of that entire chain, generation after generation. Now look at where that chain leads today. The most recent Federal Reserve data shows the typical white family holds roughly 6 times the wealth of the typical black family. And here's the part that should really give you pause. Between 2019 and 2022, the overall wealth gap didn't shrink. It grew by nearly $50,000, even as the country as a whole got richer. When we ask the second question, were the effects of the past actually addressed, the record says no, not evenly, and not by accident. A law meant to lift an entire generation into the middle class was administered in a way that excluded a huge share of black veterans specifically. And that single decision is still measurably compounding in bank accounts today. That's condition 2. Test it against the record. Now we owe the video its hardest section. Why a person would say, get over it. Because so far, everything we've shown supports the case against get over it. Fairness means we now examine truthfully what someone means when they say get it over it, because they have actual good reasons for saying so. Here is why someone would say get over it, and it deserves to be heard in full, not as a strawman. Plenty of groups have faced brutal circumstances, discrimination, poverty, violence, and still closed the gap with everyone around them within a generation or two, without anything like reparative policy. If that's true, structural harm alone can't be the whole explanation. Take Irish immigrants who fled the famine in the 1840s. An estimated 1 million people died. Another million fled, most of them to America, arriving penniless, widely hated, and openly discriminated against for being poor and Catholic in a country that was neither. Newspapers at the time ran cartoons depicting the Irish as subhuman. Employers posted signs reading, "No Irish need apply." Researchers who tracked the actual sons of those famine-era immigrants found something striking. By 1880, one single generation later, those sons had closed most of the gap in job status compared to native-born Americans. Despite the poverty, despite real discrimination, despite the trauma of watching 1 million people starve, the economic gap had nearly disappeared within 20 years. That's a real well-documented case, and it's worth taking seriously instead of dismissing. It suggests that discrimination and hardship, even severe hardship, don't automatically lock a group out of economic mobility for generations. Sometimes the gap does close quickly, on its own, without government apology, without targeted policy, just through work, time, and the next generation getting a slightly better starting point. So, if that's possible for one group, the honest question has to be asked. Why would it be different for anyone else? Why should Black Americans, generations removed from slavery, be treated as a special case, when other groups facing real, documented suffering manage to close their own gaps without needing the country to treat their situation differently? This is a legitimate argument with proof, and it's not a stupid one. It's actually a fair question built on real research, not just a dismissive slogan. Before we can answer it honestly, we have to take it exactly this seriously. Because the answer, if there is one, has to survive contact with a real comparison, not a convenient one. Let's actually test that comparison instead of just accepting or rejecting it. The first thing worth checking is duration. The Irish famine lasted about 5 years. The suffering that followed lasted maybe a generation. Slavery in America lasted 246 years, followed immediately by another century of black codes, peonage, and convict leasing before anything resembling freedom actually took hold. That's not a small difference. It's the difference between recovering from one bad decade and recovering from 12 generations stacked on top of each other, each one starting from less than the one before. A single generation of hardship and 12 straight generations of engineered disadvantage aren't the same size of a problem, even if the emotional toll of discrimination looks similar on the surface. The second thing worth checking is whether the harm was left alone, to fade, or actively renewed. Irish immigrants faced real prejudice, but no law was passed specifically to keep rebuilding that prejudice generation after generation. Compare that to redlining, which was federal policy, actively renewed decade after decade, specifically targeting where black families could and couldn't buy homes well into the 1960s and beyond. Now, let's test the case people usually reach for as proof that quick recovery is simply what happens. Japanese American internment during World War II. It's often cited as an example of a community that suffered badly and bounced back fast. But when economists actually studied it, using real income and education data, that's not what they found. Researchers at Harvard tracked what actually happened to interned families and their children, and found the internment entrenched economic inequality for 50 years. Not 5, not 10, 50, with outcomes depending heavily on which random camp a family happened to be sent to. Formal government redress didn't arrive until 1988, decades after the war ended, and only after Japanese American members of Congress fought for it directly. So even the case people casually cite as proof that groups just bounce back turns out, once you check the actual research instead of the folklore, to be a story about decades of quiet damage and a very long wait for any kind of repair. That doesn't diminish the Irish comparison. It does mean comparisons like this need real evidence, not a vague sense of how things usually go. Put together, here's what the honest comparison actually shows. Shorter harm without active repetition can close a gap in a generation the way it did for Irish immigrants. Longer harm, actively repeated by policy for another century, tends to take far longer to close, if it closes at all, which is exactly what the Japanese American case shows, and exactly what the wealth gap numbers on slavery's aftermath still show today. That doesn't make anyone in either group less resilient, and it doesn't hand anyone a free pass. It just means the three conditions from Section 2, the harm stopping, the damage being addressed, enough time and resources existing to rebuild, actually explain the difference in outcomes far better than any story about which group tried harder. So let's go back to the three conditions we set at the start. Did the harm actually stop? Were the effects addressed? Has there been enough time and resources to rebuild? We've tested all three against the actual record now, not against the slogan and not against the feeling. The evidence gives a clear, if uncomfortable, answer. Condition 1, did the harm stop? Gets a partial no. Slavery ended in 1865, but forced labor in the form of debt peonage and convict leasing continued in some form for another century, formally ending only in 1966. The clock on recovery, unfortunately, doesn't start at 1865. For a huge number of families, it barely started before most of the 20th century was already gone. Condition 2, where the effects addressed, also gets a no, and this one has a paper trail. The GI Bill, one of the biggest wealth-building programs in American history, was administered in a way that excluded most black veterans who earned it. That single policy decision is still measurable today in a wealth gap that isn't just present but actively growing. Condition 3, has there been enough time and resources to rebuild, is the hardest one because, unlike the Irish case, Where the damage was left alone to fade naturally, this damage kept getting repeated. Redlining, uneven GI Bill access, and their downstream effects on schools and neighborhoods didn't stop being reinforced until well within living memory for people who are still alive today. If all three conditions matter, and the evidence shows two of them clearly weren't met, and the third has barely had a fair chance to run its course, then get over it isn't really a request. It's an instruction to finish a recovery that, by the country's own historical record, was never actually allowed to fully begin. Here's the part worth sitting with. Nobody watching this owned a slave. Nobody watching this passed the GI Bill or drew a redlining map. But here's what's also true. If your family wasn't the one excluded from those loans, wasn't the one still working off a debt in 1960, you inherited a better starting point, whether you asked for it or not. That's not guilt. It's arithmetic. Wealth compounds, and so does its absence. A family given a fair shot in 1947 and a family denied one in the same year weren't just unequal for a year. They were unequal for every year afterward, compounding quietly long after anyone alive today made a single choice about it. So, can you actually get over something like this? Yes, genuinely. Yes, the three conditions aren't impossible to meet, but they have to actually be met first. The harm has to fully stop. The damage has to be addressed, and enough time and resources have to exist to finish the rebuild. Skip that and get over it isn't healing. It's just asking someone to stop mentioning it.